Jesus freak here. This is something a little more unusual than the usual typical Bibles that cover on channel. It's a facsimile edition of Novum Instrumentum, first published Greek New Testament printed. There was one printed earlier, but it wasn't able to get published until later. This is apparently sold by a site called reformedchurchpublications.org. I don't know anything about them. Now, this is the first edition of Erasmus Greek and Latin New Testament. The Greek on one side, Latin on the other. Now, camera focus isn't exactly justice. Actually, a lot sharper than a shot would make. The importance of this to me beginning of the gospel. See, back in 2007, I decided to start work on a translation of the New Testament. I can't read Greek, but I can somewhat read Latin. And this, what I had, I believe, was a folder of JPEGs. Contained a simile. And at the time, a lot of this stuff was really hard to come by. And I'm not really going to go into the actual book too much. But I'm going to basically go into more what it represents. You see, around this time, we were starting to get a push to get the Greek New Testament print, as opposed to just the Latin version that had been in print for a couple hundred years at that. And about 100 years. And there were a couple separate attempts. This one was a little bit rushed, and eventually he wound up doing another edition to try to fix it. This was originally published in 1516. It's obviously not a 1516. Now, this represents the Byzantine text mostly. There's a few places where Erasmus might have used the Vulgate to fill in a hole, or he might have used, I don't know if his manuscripts were all of the Byzantine. We know what they all were. There were 7 of them. He had access to an 8th and rejected it. He had access to one from, I believe it was the 8th century, but opted not to use it. He used 5 manuscripts from the 12th century, 2 from the 15th. And took only 5 months to put it together. Now, The idea of verse numbers wasn't really a thing at the time. I mean, that came from Stephanus several decades later. You look at there's chapter numbers, Roman numerals on the side, 5 over here. No verse number. Top of the screen right now, you can quoniam tres sunt testimonium dant spiritus in aqua et anguis tres sunt. No comma Johannium in the first 2 editions. He added it in the 3rd. This, along with a copy of the Clementine Vulgate from volulsearch.sf.net, were pretty much the only resources I had from the time I was working on it. Now, the style of printing is a bit weird because there's a lot of scribal abbreviation. The use of I versus J is a bit weird, as is U versus V. There's long S, which of course some people F. You can see a lot of scribal shorthand and abbreviations. It took me a while to get used to. And it's not the perfect edition, but it's what it is. As, like I said, was actually invaluable to me. Latin is very similar to Greek, and Latin translation is very. Ugh, a little. Now, when I translated, the result did come out very similar to what you would expect. Textus Receptus, Latin, which the Latin version was the focus more than the Greek. Having a Latin translation opened things up because at the time in Europe, Latin was well understood, but Greek really wasn't. So You got the advantage, you know, you had the Greek if you could read it. And if you couldn't, read it in Latin. About everyone who could read at all could read Latin. It was still the lingua franca of Europe. Now, I never actually learned Latin. So you might ask, well, how do you have any idea what it says? You see, in school I studied French and Spanish. I lost most of my, kept most of my Spanish. Between that and the fact that there are a lot of Latin based words, I was able to have a very good idea of what I was reading. Occasionally, if I had issues, I would look at the King, how they handle. I'd look at Richard Challoner's translation of the Vulgate, how he handled. Anyway, thought I'd bring this. Just freak out.